Live from the Isolate Tower, this is Derailed Trains of Thought. All right, Tim, welcome.
I know we kind of need to keep our voices down here.
There's a lot of studying going on.
But this isn't NPR. And I think we've somehow managed to find a relatively safe room where we can talk.
There's not many people here. It's a big place.
Well, yeah.
It echoes a little bit, but
yeah, I mean it's very peaceful, except when the guy with the book is kind of looks up and glares at you.
yeah, I wouldn't want to make.
Yeah, thankfully, I think we found another room that's I don't actually want to whisper have people.
No, that'd be a hard
podcast. Yeah, it'd be hard to listen to, I think. But it's a very studious place.
I really kind of feeling just go sitting in for a little bit. It sounds kind of interesting.
Yeah.
A little mind numbing after a while. But.
Yeah, part of me would also be really curious to explore this island that we're on. Like it seems very like it almost kind of makes me think of like a Renaissance fair almost.
I think maybe we'll have to go. I hear there's some weird little creatures running around too.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Some
friends with.
Check out the wildlife.
Yeah, exactly.
So cool. I'm happy to be here at Isolate Tower with you.
Well, I'm glad because I don't want to do a podcast by myself.
It's probably quite the change from what kept you from podcasting with me last month.
Yeah.
The youth event.
Yes, it was quite 2,200 youth all. For what 4 or 5 days, giant, very loud music that like makes you feel like your organs are shaking around inside of you. Yeah, very different than here.
Yeah,
good nonetheless, but very different.
That's good. They had a good time.
Yeah, it was a good conference. Great speakers as always. Yeah, it went really well. Besides that, I guess we'll go ahead and start the study place, Story School. I think this actually, I don't know whose idea this was originally, but then you said, let's do this one.
I think it might have been my idea because I remember having a conversation with someone actually back when I was working at the Italian Grill.
Okay.
About words and how a word could be. Basically, what we're going to talk today about is words and meaning.
Words and meaning, very philosophical.
Very philosophical. And I think which is one of the reasons why I suggested the topic like 2 years ago.
And we're like, yeah, we'll do that.
Been kind of putting it off. But, this is the conversation I had with the guy was basically, I don't remember how it came about now because it's been a while, but I was talking with a coworker and his perspective was this whole sort of words can mean pretty much anything you make them to mean. You can choose to mean because we invent words. We come up with words to describe the world around us.
'Twas brillig.
What?
'Twas brillig and all the mimsy toesed wob and mimsy in the way. Yeah, Jabberwocky. You ever read that poem?
Oh, okay.
Lewis Carroll just made junk up. Warble sword wouldn't snicker snack.
Pretty much.
Anyways.
Well, Dr. Seuss did the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, horrible sidetrack. I just had to say 'twas brillig.
But another aspect of this, too, is that we live in such a visual media world nowadays. That there's not even necessarily a great focus on what words are trying to say.
That's
They're just kind of a means to an end. We kind of stick words together to make them do whatever we want them to.
In an internet culture, it's too long didn't read. You just kind of skim the headlines and...
Yeah, exactly. And
words are simply informational.
And it can be sort of a mindset for some people even. Like I've heard of people who will like, a friend of mine was telling me about one game channel he watches on YouTube where it'll be two guys play it together, but the one guy who's playing will usually just kind of skip past like all the introduction or all the text screens, and then he'll get to that gameplay. He's like, "Wait, what am I doing?" Because he had no patience to actually read what was in front of him.
When I was young, I had a friend who played role playing games, but he didn't much care about all the talking. I'm like, why are you playing a role playing game? That's like half the point. At least for me, it was.
Yeah, but the quintessential sort of conflict between the modern visual and like old school, the importance of words. I always go back to think of in undergrad at Taylor University Upland. There was an art school there, and one of the things the senior art school students had to do was a special display, the senior display.
Okay.
There wasn't always room for it they have a little art gallery, but there wasn't always room for all the seniors. So sometimes it would be in other places like in hallways or at the library. Well, in one time they did a thing in the library out in, before you got into the main area where the books are. I don't know if you've been to Upland Library maybe.
A few times, yeah.
There's kind of a lounge area out there. And so this time he had a display out there, and his whole theme, I think it was two guys actually. The whole theme of the art display was "Words are dead, image is king." And
as a writer, I protest.
I don't remember all the details of it. I think they had some big easels and things like that. And all the paper on it was made up of pages torn out of old books.
Okay.
Basically, and, just kind of plastered on the walls. And I think there was I think there was a TV with a woman or a face or something, like a talking head, basically, but you couldn't hear what they were saying. They were talking. Okay. At least if I remember, I think that was part of it. That may be something from Doctor Who. I don't know. And I think there was also like a bicycle that was covered in these papers.
Okay.
No one really understood what the bicycle was for. But anyway, that was kind of the theme of the thing. Well, the same time this came out, I was in a basic rhetoric communication class because my major was mass communications at Taylor Upland, and I was there mostly for video and media stuff. So having to go to a rhetoric class that was all about like studying Greek philosophers was really not my thing, and really not the thing of the other sort of people. But it was a requirement at that time of being part of the communications department to take this class. And the teacher of that class was this upper 60s, little old, like 5'4" woman. Okay. Very classic. And so she actually wound up having the two guys who did this art display in her class. And she said, when I saw your display, I was so profoundly disturbed by it because I've devoted my entire life to words and teaching students how important communication is and having the exact words. And she said, the only word I could use to convey my disturbance by this would be rape, which is like, okay, that's a little extreme, but she
uses the word on purpose.
Yeah, she uses that word on purpose. Yeah. And it was an interesting conversation because our class is made up of people who were, wanting to go into public relations, and they did value the written word and that kind of stuff. And then some of us who we value that, sure, but it wasn't really our primary focus. Yeah. But it was interesting to kind of get into the mind of one of these artists. I remember one thing he said is like, he felt he was flattered in some ways, but that he managed to elicit such a strong reaction. Yeah. But I remember one of the things he said is that he felt so strongly that words were kind of going out. He said, like, I don't even necessarily think in terms of words anymore. I guess he was a very visual sort of person.
Wow. Yeah, that's way different than I am.
Yeah. And that was even like, I think pretty much everyone in our class, this was like probably midway through the semester. And after we were talking, I was like, that sounded weird. Like, even if you are a more visual person than some people, like just about everyone, I think at some point verbalizes to themselves what they're going to say, or,
Well, and he was explaining his reasoning for his art with words.
Yeah, exactly. And this is kind of the whole point. I mean, we talked about...
we're on a podcast.
We are on a podcast where we use words quite a bit to explain.
Not always well, but...
And, is interesting. I showed you an XKCD strip that was about basically how words, it's hard to even trust what they mean because in some way they're so artificial. Mm-hmm. Like I said, you can use words to make up stuff. So how can they actually mean anything? But they actually did another strip more recently. I think it was with a Humpty Dumpty type character or something, where he was basically making the same argument, but then the other person in the conversation was using the same sort of refutal that you and I had to the comic, but you're using words to claim that words are pointless.
Yeah. Yeah. You can't get around it. No one communicates in normal life very well without words. I mean, I just finished Three Musketeers. Aramis tries to communicate without words to his servant, but... Sorry, random. I had to throw that in there. It was an interesting thing. Like, they hardly ever talk to each other. He just makes a signal, and his servant knows what he wants. And but you usually think it's deficient if you're not talking to someone you know. Mm-hmm. You don't just like wink at them or do like charades. Charades is a game because it's
Because you're limited by not actually being able to
Yeah.
use words.
So where do you want to go with this? I got things I'm thinking of, but
Well, I guess first, obviously, words have a place. But
Yeah.
I guess let's address the question of how important of a place. Because there's that saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can say a lot more with just a picture sometimes. So what is the value then necessarily of words? Obviously, some are usually you can't do without. But
it seems like when we talked, I was listening to old podcasts. I don't remember which one. When we talked about kind of visual versus written medium.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with visual stuff largely is that they're much more ambiguous.
it's more open to interpretation.
More open to interpretation. Words are specific. The whole reason poets choose just the right word is to not choose all the not right words. And I feel like, that images tend to be more emotionally charged inherently than words need to be. You know, like rhetoric class, you're choosing words to make points, to make arguments, to make logical. I mean, that's one of the main uses of words, and you can't make image. You can use images for arguments. I mean, I've seen it done effectively.
But words are a little bit more precise in terms of like making a logical. They're almost like the replacement. If a logical argument is with a mathematical equation, then words are in place of numbers, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, at least it's how it's been used. Again, that's the Western way. I don't know,
How Eastern people would.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a difference or not a difference on that. See, the problem when we start talking about words, I always want to go back to the more philosophical state of, and this is probably going too far at this point, but like, as Christians, words are inherently important. God speaks and things are created. We say that the important truths are embodied in a book and not in images. That there's something unique about words. Most of the prophets, not all of them, most of the prophets get words from God. Sometimes you get a weird person like Ezekiel who all gets like images, or Zechariah or Daniel. But those are actually not the norms for how God communicates to people.
Well, and talk a little bit. I looked a little bit at. There was a book that you had suggested.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet either. But
Okay, how do you say this guy's name?
I don't really know offhand.
Poithius Verne. In the beginning was the Word.
Oh, that's the name of it?
I think that's the name of it. Yeah. So it's a free book.
He allows it for. I think he probably sells it as well, but it's
okay.
on his website. You can freely download it because he's more concerned than people.
Anyway, so I skimmed some of this because
I would like to read it someday.
it's like a 400-page book.
Yeah.
So it's very scholarly, very academic. But from what I skimmed, some ideas. He also talks about, well, in the beginning was the Word.
Yeah.
And the Word in there is a direct reference to God.
Yeah.
To Jesus, that by him all things are made, and without him nothing was made that has been made, meaning referring to the Word or Jesus. So in a sense, it almost made me wonder if one reason why the third commandment is don't use God's name in vain is because God takes language so seriously. Like there is nothing without language. He is language.
Well, like Jesus says, he says in the Sermon on the Mount, let your yes be yes, your no to no. Anything else is from the devil, basically.
Yeah.
That there's a sense that, well, it's interesting that's biblical. But if you just go to stories, language in the more fantastical stories or the more epic stories is so important. When you make a promise, it's binding. You don't break your word. That's like almost magic in certain word. And then there's other things where knowing the right word in all kinds of literature, or even in occult stuff, knowing the right word gives you power over things.
Well, that was a big deal in Wizard of Earthsea, and probably in the other Earthsea books, but that's the only one I've read.
Yeah,
so far.
in the Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin, knowing the word, the true name of something gives you power over it, and that that's sort of the thing of relating misusing God's name. And when your name's Yahweh, I am who I am. It doesn't give you power over him when he's like, I am whatever I am.
Yeah,
as opposed to more magic. Sort of thing.
Well, and it's interesting. I guess that word Yahweh, I think super Orthodox Jews wouldn't even pronounce it.
No, and they won't. Yeah, and it's written without the vowel, so you don't pronounce it, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, I remember hearing that.
But it's very interesting, at least in the Christian thought process, history. Words have always been, we always call each other people of the book. That books, words are important. It's interesting now, and we'll get off the biblical thing in a second, but. It's interesting. Almost every time people, like prophets, have visions, a lot of times they're like, they have to ask an angel to explain, what does this mean? They never do that when he just gives them words.
That's an interesting point.
I just now thought of that. Meaning there's an
Ambiguous.
ambiguity. Haha. See, I can't use words right, but I try. Well, it's interesting. Poetry, people usually say the highest form of literature is poetry. Because you use the least amount of words to communicate the most amount of stuff.
Ideas.
And, we've always kind of inherently thought poetry was elevated. I mean, a lot of, religious literature is in poetic form, or epics, used to be poems, because that was a higher form.
Well, it's sort of a dance, because it's like a dance between words and rhythm.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
You have to pick very specific words, not only for the meaning, but for the sound and for the pace. I guess that's why they consider it more elevated, because it's so intricate.
Now, in defense of images, since you talk about, poetry is kind of like music and song, music without lyrics has a lot of power.
Oh, sure.
But it also has a lot of fluidity. Once you throw a lyric on it, it means something. Which is why I can use things without lyrics, and I'll write all kinds of short stories off of them. But someone else could listen to the same thing and get something completely different out of it. In theory, a well-written piece of thing is trying to communicate something specific. Now, people can misinterpret it, get different things out of it. You might want them to get different things out of it. And words do change in meaning.
Well, yeah, the same word can mean different things in different cultures.
Exactly. Or even just in different sentences.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I mean,
English is a particularly pliable language in that way.
So, I mean, there is a certain truth that words are fluid.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting, one of the very first jobs God gave man was to go name things.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, it's pretty remarkable when you think about
of all the things you could do.
Yeah, like it's our first act God gave humans was to be creative in a sense.
Yeah,
like because obviously God had his own names for giraffes and elephants and things like that.
Yeah,
and our English names for those things now are different than probably what Adam would have come up with.
Yeah,
but language itself is sort of a human means of imitating God, I think. Of creativity.
And I mean,
expression.
Even from a non-creative point of view, language is really the thing that separates us from the rest of the animals. Nothing else has the sort of capacity for language. I mean, brain-wise, neurologically, like infants and up to 2 or 3 year old they're hardwired for language. Mm-hmm. They learn language at an absurd rate. Which is not an easy thing to learn when you think about it. Or if you ever try to learn language when you're not 2.
Yeah. A different language.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Sorism, which is a book which was coming out this fall.
A book that you wrote and edited and
Nathan Aaron
also wrote on it. Mm-hmm.
But it was interesting because I tried to write a character who grew up kind of wild child, raised by wolves sort of mentality, never learned language, and then have the early chapters where he has this encounter and suddenly words exist in his, and try to communicate that there was a certain level of being he had, and that once words encapsulated reality, that the way he thinks about things and views himself and can process past and future completely changes. I stole some of that when you read Tarzan. I don't know if you ever read Tarzan.
No, I've never read it.
It's it's interesting because he reads French and he learns to speak English. It's weird, but that idea of not knowing language and what it does. Again, I was making up. There's probably studies of people who've done that actually, but I think even how you can process information, your world, and where you sit in it changes once you have words for things. Like you ever seen those they'll go on Facebook sometime. These German words for feelings you have but you never knew a name for.
No.
Like ones like, where you suddenly glimpse. I wish I can't.
Some very
very specific emotions that everyone feels, and once you see the word for it, you're like, yes, that's what I meant.
I needed a word for
this.
I
needed a word for that.
Sure.
One more interesting story, unrelated. I read a story about the Cherokee Indians. A book, actually, about the Trail of Tears and everything beforehand. But when the guy came in and tried to teach them, he wrote down a language. They didn't have a written language. Uh-huh. And he taught a child the written language, and they'd say something, he'd write something down, he'd give it to the child, and the child could say, and they're like, it's witchcraft. That you could...
Oh, really?
Yeah, they thought it was just like, that you could write this thing and it would communicate this meaning to another person. Because we don't ever think about it. Uh-huh. Because we're such a literate culture. Uh-huh. Who knows, it might turn into a post-literate culture at some point. But this idea that the fact that I can put a word down and it communicates images, meaning, experiences to another person.
Well, that's the bizarre thing about words in some ways, because if you think about one, it's an abstract concept that exists in our minds somehow. Two, then it has to be spoken or communicated in some way. And, if it's spoken, it's weird lip and mouth and tongue movements that I'm currently making with my mouth and lips and teeth. Or it's a written thing where you're using ink or lead or pencils, whatever, to have certain weird shapes that's and you look at that and you decipher it as a word.
Yeah.
That was one other thing in some of what I was browsing through in the beginning was the word, because he talks about how, and I'm not going to be able to remember the exact three things, but he talks in some ways about how a word itself has those three things. One, it has a definition, like if it's a dog, it's it's the idea of that animal.
Yeah.
As a grammar sort of sense, dog is singular. If you add an S, then it becomes a plural thing. So there's grammar to every single word. And then there's I think it's the physical representation or something like that.
How it's either spoken or written.
Yeah. And he points out how it's like, if you don't have any of those three things, you don't have a word. And it's just interesting, again, the whole God being the word, God 3 in 1. It's just
that is interesting.
Yeah, it's like, whoa, that's a crazy parallel.
I feel like, it sounds on one hand kind of ridiculous. On the other hand, words are, they're astounding. Just language in general is a fascinating thing. I listened to this entire, the teaching company had a whole thing on linguistics, how language changes and everything. I listened to it. But they were talking about a whole group of sign language kids. And just in that generation, they create a whole jargon and everything. It was just sign language. You couldn't even speak, but it evolved and changed, and they all understood things, and no one else outside that group did.
Yeah,
this sort of thing between
people.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. It makes me think of the idea of the Trinity again, which I still owe C.S. Lewis a great deal of gratitude for this understanding of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, where he said, who I am when I interact with you, or if I interact with another person, is sort of a different thing. Me being by myself is not quite complete, or it's a different side or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas God is kind of got, because it's 3 in 1,
he's
constantly
in
interacting. Yeah, he's in community. It's a constant sort of community thing. And that's getting a little away from the word idea.
But I guess it's got to be communication between 3 people.
Yeah. So
or 3 person. Yeah.
One of the other interesting things about being in a communications program, and it's interesting, Taylor doesn't do that now. Now there's a media program and there's communications thing, which I understand. I think there's advantages and disadvantages of doing that. You're definitely more focused in on the actual, if you want to be a cinematographer, you don't necessarily need to learn some of this other theory type stuff. And there's certainly some theory type stuff that I think really has very limited use outside of academics. But one of the things I do recall from even public speaking class, and thinking this is either really useful or the most blindingly obvious thing that we just don't think about. It's just when we communicate from one person to another, I'll have in my head something that I think I will understand perfectly clear, and then I try to translate it to you. It comes out of, if you were, Nick is watching me points in my head and then points in my mouth, but you can't see that.
Closed captioning available.
But basically, so you've got an idea in your head. Communication is basically trying to project that idea from my head into your head, and the means to do that in this case is spoken word, or it could be written word.
Yeah.
And my understanding is perfectly clear. Whether or not I'm able to successfully transfer that to your head is, depends on my use of good language.
To reverse it, it's interesting. A lot of times I know people, or myself, we don't quite know what we think until we verbalize it.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Until you write it down or until you tell someone, then you're like, oh, that's what I meant. Sometimes putting things into words helps you make the connections that you couldn't make if you're just thinking about it.
And I think we've accomplished that a couple of times in story school.
Well, many times in story school.
We're like, what are we going to talk about here? And then we by the time it's like, wow, I learned something.
Yeah, exactly. So there's something magical that happens. And I'm only doing that half tongue in cheek because you read enough fantasy stuff, words are magic.
Yeah.
You say things, you make promises, you find the true name. Even Never-Ending Story, you need to name the childlike empress. And then that saves the entire universe.
Yeah.
Well,
and how many spells depend on the right magic words or,
pronouncing it right. And and it's something that seems to be intuitively just understood. I mean, it shows up in pagan stuff all the time, but just kind of intuitively, I mean, it's misused and whatever, but that words matter.
Yeah.
Even in a proverb sense, the tongue can bring life or death. And that's a whole nother part of language that how I say things affect you. Whole lives been ruined. We say sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. But it's just a lie.
Yeah, words can build up and they can tear down,
and images can too. I mean, to a certain extent, but there's just there's a distinctness to the power, to the information communicated, to the clarity that words bring about. The images I don't think can do in the same sort of distinct way.
Well, given that, let's
they do art therapy and then get emotions out.
Yeah. And given that, let's look a little briefly then at where did the idea come from that words are so malleable? Why does postmodernism attack the meaning understanding of words?
Because postmodernism.
Well, when we're debating what even the meaning of the word is. I mean, that's sort of a classic. I mean, even that's going back several years, almost 20 years ago now.
Yeah. In that time period. I listened to Ravi Zacharias, apologist, some of his podcasts, and he has this story he tells. I'm going to butcher it, but he saw the newspaper. One was, or maybe it was a TV, they were asking people around the street, do words mean anything or just do you make up the meaning? They're like, oh, meanings are made up. And you're like, are they right and wrong? Oh, no, just up to each other. And then the third thing was if Saddam Hussein doesn't stop playing these word games, we're going to have to punish him. So basically, right and wrong doesn't matter. Words don't mean anything, but.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because we have talked about how words have a certain malleability, how a certain group of people together will come up with a certain understanding of a word.
Yeah.
The words will be different across cultures. But just because we have that sort of creativity, that sort of misunderstanding, that doesn't mean that there isn't a root understanding to all that.
And I don't know why in postmodern, again, I haven't read postmodern theory and language, and I wonder how much of it's rooted in a preconception of that there is no truth, and then you work backwards to words, or whether there's something inherent in words they think doesn't have meaning, and then they work towards, where do they start? If you start with the idea that there's no truth, then of course you're going to say, well,
then words aren't that important.
It's kind of like this. It's probably just I don't know. If you know more than I do on this, please write us. But, almost like reader response. On one hand, it's true. You read a story, different people respond in different ways. But the more extreme version will be the meaning of the story is only in what you think it means. As opposed to the writer meant something, and that's what it means, and we react differently, and that's just part of how language works and how we come to other people's things.
And part of how art works.
Yeah, exactly. But there's that sort of reader response, and the reader response says the entire meaning of the work depends on what you take it to be, which I don't think is fair to the piece of art. I mean, but if you just say that, almost that if inherently truth is personal, if here's what I'm saying, but here's what you're getting, and there's no reason why we should bridge the gap.
Yeah.
Then you could say words, it's almost like personalized culture. So there's different meanings over culture. You just say, well, my individual culture is different than your individual culture. So then when we both say, let's eat a sandwich, we just hope that we both mean the same thing. I don't know. I'm kind of making it up. But
no, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, there has to be a certain level of cooperation or a certain sort of goal of trying to get to the same understanding of
unless
something.
You don't even care.
Yeah, unless you don't want to come to the same understanding. Then we have completely different definitions of what a man and a woman is.
Yeah, and so maybe that's the whole thing, that if you don't actually care what the other person was trying to say, you only care what you get out of it, then words stop having
their
much power.
effectiveness.
The effectiveness, because the whole point.
Because you're purposely blocking that effectiveness in a sense.
Yeah. Or twisting it, or
or rebelling against it, or
diluting it. Let's get the thesaurus out. We'll just keep going.
It becomes fake news. It's like,
but there's a reason dictionaries exist. So you can say, what does this actually mean?
Yeah,
and they get different meanings over time. Like silly used to mean saintly, and now it means silly.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and again in that teaching company session about linguistics, you'd be like silly Saint Mary, silly Mary, and it was more saintly. Silly being more innocent.
Okay.
And over years, it turned from innocent to not wise to,
Oh, interesting.
kind of went that angle. Which is why sometimes when we read Shakespeare, there's certain words that just don't mean what they used to mean. But
yeah. And there's all kinds of examples of that sort of thing.
Yeah, certainly. I'm all over the place this short story school. I'm like, let's just tell stories today.
So what should writers and storytellers take away from this whole conversation? Abandon words or use words?
Well, okay, I'm a writer, but I think I would encourage writers to not just use words as like, I'm just going to try to be workmanlike with words, but really care about words. There's a lot of power, and anyone who's read a good book knows this. Mm-hmm. You like the book because how it's, okay, not everyone, but there's a certain type of book you like because of how it's written. Mm-hmm. And that's because of the words they chose, not just because the plot. If you only cared about workmanship, about, I'll just get plot through, that's one thing, but there's so much in, you read the story because how it says it. And that's something that, is a person who knows how words work. And I think creators or reviewers find those things that make you think, I'm glad he wrote it this way. Mm-hmm. And then see, like, that's why you care about words. And then try to do that in your own work.
Yeah.
It's not just, another story real quick. Summer read The Maze Runner, or no, listened to an audiobook. She says it's wretched as audiobook.
Really?
Because it's just so, Summer's very tuned into pretty words. But it's very just blunt and clunky and just very action.
Interesting.
Without the, I don't know. And Natasha knows it quite as much reading it. But when you hear it out loud, it feels like it's like, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. When I listened to parts of the Silmarillion audiobook, and the thing that surprised me in some ways was the guy who read it. He did a fine job, but it was a different. I didn't listen to the whole thing.
Yeah,
but it was almost more of a trying to even sort of. I don't know quite if it was a different accent.
You need the right words.
Yeah, exactly. I need the right words to describe it. I almost had kind of a Celtic or a not even Celtic. It's not the right word. It's the sort of guy that you might picture if he was like a druid, reading it or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas I think because of the Lord of the Rings movies, and you've got Galadriel talking very, and it's much more ethereal, which is how I had usually read a lot of it, and so not necessarily in Galadriel's voice, not that specifically. No, Kate Blanchett did not impress that strongly on me, but still, I think I was influenced more by that sort of hearing the language in that way, as opposed to, I don't know that either was necessarily. I don't know. I'm not a Tolkien linguist that I could say which is really the best sort of pronunciation or delivery of that sort of thing. But it is interesting that even the sound of it carries a different sort of vibe. But that might be another sidetrack.
So yeah, I think all writers should have a high view of words. And maybe sometime we should do a whole thing on imagery.
That would be an interesting counterpoint to this. And
we do it in 2 years from now. Yeah, not so much knocking imagery, but there's something very special about words.
Yeah, I think
its own thing.
I think there should be a dialogue or a continual conversation between words and imagery. I'm not sure how words say stuff, and then there's a picture to throw out.
What's interesting? Words create imagery, but I don't think imagery create words as easily.
Well, you have to like interpret imagery through words, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just random.
Yeah, it's interesting. But anyway,
way off topic.
Yeah,
okay,
but we're going a little long here, so we should probably wrap it up.
All right. So, anyways, use your words nicely.
Choose your words wisely.
Choose your words wisely.
And it seems like such an obvious thing.
That's like something like the wizard says to the choose your words wisely.
But I mean, again, that's kind of the whole mystique. I mean, it's something that we take for granted so easily, but when you dissect it, it's almost like a science. Like how do plants grow? Well, on a basic level, it's understandable. When you dig into the biology of it, it's incredibly complicated.
I always tell my kids, I'm like, look at this. I threw some dirt and some sun and some water. And we got this? This has nothing to do with any of those three things. Anyways, random this night.
Think about words and language that way. It's,
All right, let's move on to our soundtrack.
before we muddle our metaphors too much. Hopefully, words are great until you like stretch them beyond all meaning.
That's what puns do. I should have mentioned pun. Anyway, so Tim,
Yes.
soundtrack. I guess it's mine.
I think it's yours first. Yes.
Okay, I looked at lots of options. I went for something only vaguely related. So some things you need to use words for, and some things you really shouldn't. And so the title of this remix is "You Don't Talk About Flight Club."
Or were you just saying about puns?
I know. Interesting fact: puns were often used in religious documents because it's a higher level of language. You're elevating language to make it mean two things at one time.
Oh, okay. So
You
you
also
could-
use them in advertising, but
can you use a pun in poetry then have like a double whammy? Of,
oh yeah,
of
yeah.
high
I mean,
language?
it's not funny then.
No, okay.
But it's. I mean, I always use an example. Jeremiah is shown this vision of an almond tree, and he's like, "What do you see, Jeremiah?" And God says, "An almond tree." He's like, "Yes, exactly." And then he used some Hebrew word, which I guess is a pun on almond, to
Really?
make a point. Yeah.
God uses puns. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
God uses pun. I use it all the time to prove people when they're like, "Don't use puns." I'm like, "They're holy." That's why they don't hold water. I know that joke's all wet.
Stop it.
Anyway,
Finish introducing your song.
okay, so you don't talk about Flight Club, okay? This is from Pilot Wings, the game, and remixed by Halsey. It's lo-fi, chippy, fun stuff. Enjoy. And we're back. Hope you enjoyed that, but don't talk about it. All right, Tim, it's been a little bit. Let's do our take
on Tales.
All right, so we have this book club.
Yes, I think we've talked about it.
We mentioned it, and we read Earthsea in it, actually. That was our first book, I think.
Oh, yeah, it was.
So we mentioned that. We like name drop. It's a good way for us to get new fodder of things to talk about.
Yes.
Nothing else.
Yes. And it's nice that we can both talk about it as opposed to something you've read or something like that.
And I name dropped Musketeers, too, tonight.
That's true, which I didn't read that one.
It's a long one.
The book club itself has been struggling in consistency a little bit more.
We had a couple really long books this spring that slowed us down. And one of them, which we're going to talk about now, is The Book of Strange New Things by Michael Faber.
And this was one that I think this was your suggestion.
This was my suggestion. I had heard about it a couple years ago. World Magazine had picked it for their fiction book of the year. And it had been book of the year at various other places as well.
Yeah. I think they largely picked it because it's a secular book, but the main character is a missionary, a Christian. And it's one of the rare occasions of a secular story communicating what it's like to be a Christian in a pretty honest way, very
not derogatory, just real.
Yes, complimentary.
Yeah. So here's the general. We don't want to say, we can't say a lot about it because the book's an experience, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the main plot is that Peter is a Christian, a pastor, and he gets chosen to be a missionary on a foreign planet, where these aliens have already heard about the Bible from a previous person, and they're called Jesus Lover 1, Jesus Lover 2, Jesus Lover 3. They're very alien. And they call the Bible the Book of Strange New Things. There's other stuff in the plot, like things are happening on Earth. His wife has to stay home on Earth, and he's on this planet Oasis. And there's a lot of weird stuff happening on both planets.
Yeah, a big part of the story is his emailing, basically, for lack of they have their own.
It sounds really boring, but
but his communications with his wife is a big part of it because they, of course, separated by untold miles and this long distance, and they miss each other very much. And so she tells him about things that are going on Earth, and it's really like catastrophe level stuff.
Yeah, like really bad, like end of the world sort of disasters.
And meanwhile, he's working with these very unusual, creatures, and also kind of an odd duck, even in the other Earthlings that he's working with.
One of the main themes, and there's lots of themes. It's a very literary book.
Yes,
about 500 pages. But one of the main themes really is communication and how we relate to other people or don't relate to other people well. Well, there's a lot of levels. So him trying to communicate to his wife when they're in very different situations is a big one. Him trying to communicate with these aliens who speak very strange.
I mean, they speak English, but they have their whole other language, of course. But even their communication of things is different. Like they purposely. It's interesting. I was thinking about this in our previous discussion. They purposely use his language a lot of times because they don't have an equivalent word for to say something.
And they analyze at some point that their language is missing a lot of different ideas that the human language has, like their thought. And there's
reasons for it that we won't get into now.
And then even his coworkers are communicating with them is just one of the amazing things about this book is you just feel kind of disoriented for like 400 pages.
Yeah.
In a good way. I mean, in a very purposeful way. You just feel like you just can't quite get a hold of what's going on, which plays really well into some of the themes.
Well, and it's weird because like it's not as if it's like, it's just a very slow sort of, you can't quite put your finger on what you don't understand.
Yeah.
is the main thing. Like, he explains things well enough. It's not like,
no, it's not.
You're completely clueless.
It's not vague. I mean, it's very well written, but it's just, you're just missing something.
Yeah. There's the constant feeling of disorientation in
which is astounding, honestly.
I mean, I'll be honest, it can also be frustrating at times. You just like, please, I just want some things to start making a little more sense. Like I have such a good grasp on all this other stuff, but why is this so feeling off?
Okay, so we can't reveal much more than this, Tim. Yeah. So what do we want to say to our audience about this book? So let me start with this. I think the book is a very enjoyable read. I think the ending is very ambiguous and is where people have very different views or even maybe is a failure. The ending is almost unsatisfactory or is depending on
how you look
where you look at it. And there's so many different readings of certain things.
It's not as if when you sort of get a better grasp on what things are, it's not as if that's disappointing in a sense.
No.
Like it wasn't like that's a cop out or thing.
No, there's good answers to things.
But like,
It's hard to explain much.
yeah, but there's still sort of for a 500-page book, it almost feels like it could have been like another 100 pages.
Yes.
Like
yeah.
easily. Like if you had just a little bit
It
more
sort of kind of just ends. And there's, I think, reasons why you could say it just ends there. But there's a lot you say, but why not another 50 pages and just finish stuff up?
The fact that it almost feels a little too short is kind of ironic.
But there's a lot of themes of faith, themes of love, themes of relationships, themes of communication.
Yeah.
And you can read them different ways. Like the faith one, I know you read slightly different than I did.
Yeah, well,
by the end.
and not even toward the end.
Yeah.
It is interesting though. I don't know how much that is because for a good portion of the book, I was convinced that the author, like I've never seen an author communicate what it's like, at least some of the thought processes that a Christian has so honestly and so well.
Yeah.
So I thought for sure the author must be one. Later, I found that that's not the case, and it made it much harder for me to interpret the end of the book, as is not being reflective of the author's worldview in that perspective.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things about Peter, the character, is that, he's constantly trying to understand and kind of help other people. He asks questions about their circumstances and things like that. And I don't think he even realizes why he doesn't connect with some of the other people, some of the other humans at the base, as well as he might have connected with people elsewhere, because he had different sort of routines. And these people, these humans at the Earth base, there's something different about them, and he has a harder time connecting with them for some reason. So there's that theme of communication, and that's that whole aspect of how a Christian wants to witness. It's something I don't think very few secular works have ever come close to approaching this.
Not that I've ever read.
Well, and even not honestly, I would say not even that many Christian books in some ways. I mean, granted, I realized while reading that it's actually been a long time since I've read Christian fiction in general. So I'll be honest, I don't really know what the current status of that is. I just know that I would say from recent Christian films of the last decade, this is probably a little bit more honest in that way, in some ways.
I guess I would recommend to people like literary works and don't mind ambiguity at the end. I mean, again, while it's the Christian presented very honestly, it's not a Christian novel in the sense that you're not going to get a nice Christian
message at
the end. I think there's a lot of truth in the book.
Yes.
About life and people and stuff. But I think it could be frustrating for some people. I mean, it's kind of science fiction, it's kind of drama, it's kind of mystery, it's kind of everything.
It's really unlike any other book I've ever read.
I think that I would recommend to people who
if that sounds interesting.
Exactly. If you think that's cool to read a book that's just different, read this book. If you but I don't like different, don't touch it. It's a pull. But it's just a fascinating, weird, strange book of new things.
Yeah. Not only do you have to be okay with the ambiguity, you have to be satisfied with understanding that you're not going to get everything for 400 pages.
Yeah.
It's a big commitment.
But like my sister Summer, I think would love it.
Okay.
Like Zach, probably not.
Okay. That's fair.
Something like that. Anyway, so that's the Book of Stranger Things. Would you recommend it to that sort of people?
To the specific set of people we've recommended it to, yes.
Yes. Okay. I didn't know if you had other people where you're like, no, I don't agree with you.
No,
so.
like I said, it's a book. If I was still working in a library, I'd only have to be able to recommend it to a very specific audience.
I can see that.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a book for everyone.
No, but it's certainly, if you want it, it'd be a great book club book. There's a lot to talk about.
That's possibly true.
If you're a literary book club.
Yeah.
So, all right. Do we have time for something else or not?
Yeah, I think so. Because I wanted to cover, this is not necessarily, we're going to include this with our take on Tales because it's sort of a real life story, I guess.
It's the only place it fits.
Yeah. By the time this podcast comes out, it'll probably be a month old. But if you've followed me on Facebook or Twitter, you may have seen me talk a little bit about a kerfuffle that came up in the Muppets world, in the Muppet fan community. Actually, it was a Muppet fan site that I follow regularly, toughpigs.com. that actually first broke the story, them and another Muppet fan site, the Muppet Mindset, where they realized that one of the Muppet performers, his characters hadn't been seen in videos or appearances for quite a while. And they actually reached out to the Walt Disney Company and were told, yes, Steve Whitmire, who performs Kermit the Frog, is no longer working with us, and we wish him the best, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all we knew for a little bit. And we're like, wait, what? And so our first thought when this news broke was that, oh man, I wonder if he's not doing well.
Because he's one of the old guard, right?
He is fairly old guard. He and Dave Goles, I think, are the only Muppet performers still actively. Well, they were the only Muppet performers still actively working that were on the Muppet Show.
Okay.
Steve Whitmire was pretty young at the time, and he didn't have, like, Rizzo started on the Muppet Show, but not until like season 5.
Okay.
I think Steve Whitmire was there I think he started in like season 2, but he was doing background characters for a long time and, supporting that kind of stuff. I think he did like Ralph's other hand while Jim did.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, the Muppet performers have always been such kind of a tight-knit group and such a love for that sort of thing that it was inconceivable that one would leave or become fired. Maybe leave, because Frank Oz has kind of left to go on he basically directs now.
Yeah.
He hasn't really performed with the Muppets in a long time. But when Steve Whitmire revealed the news that he basically been fired, like way back in October, this was a huge shock.
Yeah.
To us, like, what is this all about? And his story, when this was first announced, was that basically it had kind of come out of the blue for him, that they had cited some business practices or something that he had done and he tried to work through them, but they were just letting him go. And it sounded. There are a lot of people that first off was like, okay, Disney's just being a corporate sell. This is awful. But there are some of us that are like, you don't just fire the guy who plays Kermit the Frog.
Yeah.
That's just not something that you do.
No.
Like what there's got to be more to this. And then through later, I think Disney later did a press release, and then even the Henson kids themselves weighed on, and their story was that Steve had basically tried to. At first, there was like he was trying to interject too much sway on it. Because the Muppet performers have a very specific understanding of who the Muppets should be, and sometimes it's hard because they've been kind of floundering, off and on sometimes in the last 20, 30 years or so, and sometimes different sets of producers, writers, or something may not understand that. And I guess there was there was a history of him trying to kind of push them to do things a certain way, and then push back, and there was some pushback, and then there was also some issue about a union thing that he wasn't able to go do a commercial shoot, and I think that was a minor thing, or it was the straw that broke the camel's back, depending on how you look at it. But Steve's perspective was he just couldn't understand why they couldn't just work past this stuff. But as the Henson kids started weighing on this, it was starting to get a lot uglier. Yeah. Where Brian Henson, who, if you don't know the Henson family history with all this, Jim Henson Company had the Muppets throughout the 90s, and then they sold them briefly to a German company in 2000, and they bought them back from this company because that company basically kind of oversold how big they were going to become. So anyway, Henson Company bought them back, and then they sold them to Disney. Brian said that he actually, shortly after that, he had started wishing that he had let Disney get rid of Steve a long time ago.
Oh.
Which this is all really surprising. The fact, and he was saying that basically his story was that sometimes he would like send emails after a project kind of cutting down a director or this, that, or other. And this is all really shocking to all of us, that there's this much dissension, this much non-communication or disagreement, because the Muppet behind the scenes has always been kind of seen as just as cooperative, just as much of a team sort of thing as the Muppets themselves.
Yeah.
That sort of mutual respect was kind of a keystone of that. Those of us who follow the behind the scenes stuff as much as the movies, and those of us who've been inspired by all the creativity. And so through all of this, and the sides have both sort of said different perspectives in this, I've kind of taken, I think there's two interesting takeaways from all this, because I know I'm kind of rambling, but the reason why I wanted to bring all this up and talk about it, because The Muppet fan community, like I said, is kind of an unusual thing because we get so much inspiration from what they do.
Yeah.
It's a very different level in some ways than like your average TV show because it's like this troupe of actors, this troupe of puppeteers, they work together and to see them go through this, even though I hadn't really been doing as much in the Muppet fandom in the last year or so, it was like seeing some family or friends, going through a big heartbreak and being completely blindsided by it. But I think there's a couple things you take away. One, anyone who's in the public eye, we really only know what they show us.
Yeah.
As much as we love hearing the interviews and perspectives and behind the scenes documentaries and stuff, it's very easy to forget that even that is still a production.
Yeah.
There's still an image that they are maintaining with that. And I'm not saying that the image is probably still very genuine.
Yeah.
I was thinking back in Brian Henson did a commentary for the Muppet Christmas Carol because he was the director of that movie. And I remember him saying at one point that whole conversation, the relationship between Gonzo and Rizzo, he said is very, very much the same sort of relationship that Dave Goles and Steve Whitmire have. The same sort of kind of camaraderie or like, you could just climb for those bars? Yeah. You are such an idiot. Why? And Brian said that he loves that kind of stuff because that is so much like their relationship. This very kind of, you know. And so there's obviously, there was some affection for each other there. So I think that is genuine, but there's so much more going on. And who knows, Steve may, I don't want to paint Steve as being a complete bad guy because Steve Whitmire has always been nothing but kind. I mean, he is Kermit the Frog in all the ways. And his perspective, too, in some ways in all this was that, well, I'll come back to that in a second. But anytime he's ever interacted with fans, he's the most polite, amenable. He loves interacting with fans. Yeah. But there's always a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't necessarily see. Number two is that legacies are a very hard thing to manage. Because for one thing, everyone has different perspectives on what they see in a legacy. Yeah. Jim Henson is a perfect example of that. You can see that with a number of other sort of notable figures that, especially ones that died young for whatever reason. You can have a lot of different people giving their perspective on what Martin Luther King Jr. would have done in a certain situation. And people try to point to Jim and what he did. And it's very interesting in that the conversation, not really conversation, and the sound bits that you get from both sides of this sort of struggle, that both are basically sort of saying, well, one, Jim wasn't like, he wouldn't have tolerated sort of this kind of, no one actor is more important than the others. Yeah. It's a group effort. Whereas also Steve Whitmire was also saying when Jim was first in talks with Disney shortly before his death, he was in talks with Disney even then to have them buy the Muppets. And they had a very different perspective on characters and performers than he did at the time. That you don't just get whoever to perform the thing. It was very key that one performer to one character. Mm-hmm. Unless for some reason you needed a stand-in for something, obviously. And so in his mind, that was supremely important, why he felt like he had sort of a clout, why he wanted to push to do things a certain way. So both of them are kind of pointing to Jim's legacy as sort of their foundation for why they do things. And I think that's important for those of us who look up to idols, who look up to people like Jim Henson as an inspiration, to not see them as a sole standard. Yeah. And that was one thing that when I read his biography not too long ago, and even more recent, some other book I read about how his business methodology, I started to realize kind of where he and I were on different tracks in some ways, not just and not just necessarily from a worldview perspective, although there's some of that in there too, but even just how different people work differently. Mm-hmm. I am not going to be ever going to be the workaholic that Jim Henson was. He had an insane work drive and he was able to focus so much effort on it, and that's probably not who I will ever be. Mm-hmm. But that's not to say that even though we have these different tracks, I don't have to be Jim Henson. I can be me, who God created me to be.
Not easy being green.
It's not easy being green. So I think it's interesting to realize that even our heroes are not the end all be all. Yeah. And that those of us who try to walk in their shadows, we're going to fail at times. Yeah. So that's a long spiel. And I'm sorry that I didn't leave much room for you to speak.
Oh, no, I didn't have much to say. I hadn't kept up with it. I knew it was a thing, and I figured you'd fill me in. So.
Yeah, and like I said, I knew I had a lot of thoughts about this whole thing because it's, like I said, it's weird. Like I'm not someone that normally like focuses in on celebrity gossip or all that kind of stuff. But this is one particular fandom that, I've said a lot. I'm not as invested as some people. I don't run my own Muppet fan site
Not yet.
or really even engaged in the forums and stuff. But it's something that I've always paid close attention
It's been
to.
a big inspiration.
Yeah.
And you don't like to see some of it fall apart, even the back end.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
It's unfortunate, but it's a learning thing.
yeah.
So, and even people that we really look up to, we will take different things. Like I probably enjoy movies a whole lot more than Tolkien did.
No. From what I hear, that's true. You did not much care for some of them. Man, they did not like Snow White.
Yeah.
Tolkien Lewis, man, no, they did not like Snow White at all. They had a very different view of dwarves
Yes. Well, and they had a very different view of mythology than
and fairy tales. And,
fairy tales. So they only saw the beginning of fairy tale as sort of a pop culture sort of phenomenon.
yeah, they probably would not like it at all at this point.
I imagine they'd hate Once Upon a Time, actually.
Yes, almost assuredly, with a passion, almost as much as Zach does. No,
Well, I've rambled a bit. Anything else you want to throw in here to take on tails before we wrap
I don't
it
know.
up?
Not if it's short. I thought about throw Dunkirk, but we would wait.
Dunkirk, yeah, that can wait. Next time,
That'll be a longer talk, anyways.
yeah, and we want to do probably next episode. We'll do our annual summer movie wrap
Yeah,
up.
which I don't know how many I've seen this summer actually, but anyways, okay. So I guess that'll be the end of our take on tales, and I guess we need to do some contact info in your soundtrack. So
Yes.
remember we have a Facebook page,
And we've been using it.
so come join us.
Yes, give us a like. We've been kind of stuck at like 43 likes on Facebook. I'd like to get us over to hump. We'd like to see
44. I mean 50.
I'm looking for 50 here. So invite your friends. Maybe we need some sort of incentive program.
Oh, that would be good. We should have a section of the program where it's just like, and this is our our fan advertiser section. Be like, today, actually, we're going to have an ad at some point on this podcast from Brian and Nathan. They have a promo thing. We need to go in here at some point. But
yes.
Anyways, we'll do that later.
For our spin-off podcast.
Yeah, spin-off. Yeah.
Well, not our spin-off podcast. Our we gave birth to.
We gave birth. Yeah, we.
It was conceived on our podcast.
On episode 50, right?
Yes, episode 50.
Anyways.
So for our 50th episode, maybe. For our 50th Facebook follower, maybe we need to give them something.
Yes. Anyways, we need to brainstorm a new little section for our fans. I think that'd be good.
Yeah, well, we've got listener feedback, but we haven't been able to use it because we haven't gotten much feedback. Well,
communication, guys. Words are important.
No, I mean we do have.
If you never tell your podcasters that you love them, they won't know it.
Actually, to be fair, we've had some people tell us that in person.
Yeah, I know.
But it'd be fun to have some comments to interact with.
You got a lot of comments on your update, your Comic-Con update.
Oh, that's true. We won't have time to talk about that now, but maybe in a future episode.
We should. We throw them under the bus when they do comment. So.
So
anyways, yes.
Like us on Facebook.
Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to us on iTunes. Check us out our website, derailedtrainsoftthought.blogspot.com. etc.
I think you covered it.
And check out the Weekly Hijack. We're finally getting out Doctor Who.
Yes, I apologize for the delay on that, but the nice thing about it is we were able to build up a backlog, so Weekly Hijack should be fairly weekly, consistently, I think. And even when Doctor Who ends, we might have a surprise in store.
Ooh, we're kind of excited.
Yes, but
we'll see. We'll see.
We'll see how it goes. Once Upon a Time may interrupt it. We haven't really decided how we're going to handle that yet.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
Anyways, soundtrack, Tim.
Okay, my soundtrack. Well, I'm going back to Final Fantasy IX and the Worlds Apart album, but there's a reason for this. It's not just because I like
it's a great album.
Yeah, well, that's a good reason too. But
because of Nobu Mastu.
The song from the album Biblioteca,
probably
/ Dreamer in the Library is the name of this remix, and it is by Kate the Great 19 who I've picked her before. I love her
From Final Fantasy IX, even.
Yes, and I love her style. She collaborated with Chaoli, who provided the Latin translation for the lyrics in this. So
Words are important, but Latin's even more important.
Latin words. That's when you know you're going up a scale on the remix ladder. And this song actually takes place, if you listen to the translation, which there's a really cool video that she made that I'll put on Facebook at some point, that has a translation, and it's all about reading books and words and being inspired by what that could mean for your life.
Which seems like that might apply.
I think it
So,
would.
Good.
So, and I think we're being looked at very sternly.
We're getting kind of energetic, and it's not a very energetic tower.
Yes, so we probably should quietly make our way. So until next time, this is Tim.
This is Nick.
And have a great day.
Oh